It was a cold evening in Brooklyn. Like every other restaurant on Seville Street, known for its delicious cappuccino and meals, Revuelto was packed that evening. The place buzzed with lively chatter, soft dinner conversations, and laughs over shared meals. It was the kind of atmosphere where one could unwind after a long, hard day. Despite the many options of restaurants, JD Vance walked slowly, taking in the soft evening breeze as he headed to Revuelto. It was his favorite restaurant, and though he had not been here in years, being back here was just what he needed to unwind from the pressures of running a political office. As he arrived at the restaurant, he stopped outside, looking through the glass walls with delight. Here, he could finally let go of his status and blend in with the normal folks, enjoying a cup of latte, a nice read, and the aroma of pastries that filled the air. He smiled softly, pushed open the doors, and entered the restaurant. The soft chime of the doorbell rang, and immediately, the air in the room shifted. The casual conversation ceased, and the soft laughs and hearty jokes disappeared. It seemed like his mere presence had sucked the soul out of the room, leaving everyone stunned and confused over his appearance. The Italian restaurant was not a place for high-end elites, especially those involved in politics. It was a cheap getaway for blue-collar and white-collar workers. Everyone felt Vance had walked in here by mistake. Some customers began to whisper discreetly, but others did not hide their reactions. Vance looked around, partly looking for a seat, but also trying to understand why his presence had attracted so much attention. He had kept his outfit simple, blending a simple cashmere sweater with loafers and office pants. No security, no media entourage, just him, a man out for an evening stroll and a warm drink to relax his nerves. The hostess, Claire, a woman in her mid-20s with hair tied up in a high ponytail, shook off her shock and picked up the reservation book. She quickly scanned through it, searching for Vance's name on the list. Like most people at the restaurant, she sensed Vance's presence here would trigger some hostility and outrage. Following the recent bills passed in the Senate, dining around with the common citizens was the last thing anyone expected from a senator from Ohio. As Claire flipped through the reservation book, she noticed Vance's name was not on the list. Although she was nervous to meet the senator, she composed herself and approached him with a professional smile. As she stopped in front of him, Claire forgot all her training in handling situations like this and just froze. This was not just another customer, but a U.S. senator and vice presidential candidate. Her eyes gleamed with admiration, but her boss, Mark, interrupted her before she could say anything. He was an older man with sharp features and had years of experience in dealing with difficult customers and situations. Although he tried to maintain his professionalism, it was clear to everyone that he was not a big fan of the senator. "Senator Vance," Mark said in a condescending tone, his brows slightly narrowed. Vance nodded politely. "Table for one." However, Mark didn't bother to check the reservation book or find any available seats. He didn't have to. His mind had already been made up on what he would do, and his reply was immediate. "I'm sorry," he said in a steady, controlled voice, still his irritation cracking in his tone. "We won't be able to serve you tonight." Vance's brows twitched in confusion. He tilted his head. "Is there a reason?" Mark paused just long enough for the unease on his face to be noticeable. It seemed he was trying to pick his words and hold back a sea of rage. Then, finally, he said, "This is a private restaurant. We have the right to refuse service." A heavy silence filled the room immediately, stretching far beyond their unspoken tension. A couple at the bar exchanged a knowing glance. Another leaned back as if waiting for a heated moment to unfold. It was the kind of moment that demanded a reaction, and it was clear to everyone in the restaurant that this was not just about dinner anymore. It had become something else. Still, despite the expectations in the room for a feud, Vance didn't lash out. He didn't demand an explanation either, nor did he try to use his political influence to create a scene. He simply took in the atmosphere of the room. His gaze shifted from Mark to Claire, and people's eyes were now fixed on him from all directions. However, instead of leaving, he stepped to the side and sat on an empty table near the window. Everyone in the restaurant was puzzled. The staff exchanged nervous glances, and some customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others pulled out their phones ready for a showdown. However, Mark did not want to escalate the situation as well. He calmly approached Vance. "Sir, I need you to leave." However, Vance did not move. He leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers lightly on the table as if reflecting on the moment, and then looked up. "I hear you. I just need a moment," he said. The tension inside the restaurant deepened. A small crowd of reporters had already gathered outside the restaurant, cameras in hand, eager to capture a piece or moment for their next hot news. Mark glanced toward them, his jaw tightened. The last thing he wanted was to cause a major scene, but it was too late. Behind the bar, a young waiter whispered, "This is so messed up. We served Kamala Harris here last month." His coworker shrugged. It was a different management that day, plus Harris called ahead. You don't really think this is about a reservation, do you? Another coworker said. It's a private business. They have every right to refuse him, another interrupted. Do they, though? His partner countered. Funny how private businesses' arguments change depending on who's getting denied service. We both know if he were anyone else, this wouldn't be happening. However, the debate was no longer contained within these walls. A group of supporters for the Ohio senator seated outside grew louder. They let Democrats in, but not JD Vance. It seems pretty selective. Another voice interjected. Didn't he say some crazy stuff about immigrants? Maybe this restaurant doesn't just want the backlash. The first man scoffed. Private businesses can do what they want. Conservatives always say that until it happens to them. It's called consequences. Maybe if he didn't push so much hate, people wouldn't react like this. Inside the restaurant, Mark's face darkened as he noticed the camera and journalist crews that had gathered. He didn't want things to get to this, but there was no way to dismiss the attention this had gathered now. He turned back to Vance. You're making a scene. There's no need for any of this. Vance raised a brow, his expression calm but puzzled. I haven't said a word. Mark exhaled deeply. He knew how this moment would end. No matter his approach or what he did, this moment would be picked apart and debated. Vance slowly raised his gaze again. I don't mean any trouble, sir. I just need a moment. I'll leave when I'm done. You can let me sit here quietly and get my affairs in order, or you can escalate this. I'm sure the media will like to see that, Vance said, his voice calm and steady. Mark glanced at the groups of reporters outside, and for a moment he stood quietly. He let out a cold breath and turned away. He may not have been comfortable with the senator's presence here, but he knew his restaurant would suffer public backlash and scrutiny if he did anything silly. Hushed tension hung in the air as Vance refused to leave the restaurant. Meanwhile, Claire quickly moved between tables, her eyes moving nervously toward Vance's table. She hesitated for a moment before gathering the courage to approach them. Her voice was barely a whisper. Sir, can I get you some water? Mark shot her a warning glare. Claire, don't. On the other hand, Vance shifted his gaze, looking at her for a while before softly asking, How long have you worked here? Claire shifted uncomfortably as if she was unsure if she was meant to speak. Almost 3 years, she answered softly. Vance nodded slowly, his gaze still fixed on her. Despite the hostile energy he felt in the room, this girl didn't seem bothered much by what people had to say about him. This intrigued him. Good restaurant? He asked, his voice slightly measured. Claire hesitated for a moment, unsure if she should give her honest opinion, standing just next to her boss. But Vance's gaze did not linger. She could not tell why this was important to him, but she answered, Yes, sir, it's a good restaurant. Something in her tone struck a chord with Vance, making him lean forward, eyes narrowing in thought. I've been here before, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Mark's eyes widened in shock. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words formed a lump in his throat. Years ago, Vance continued, his voice softening. The memories returned. The last time I sat at this restaurant, it was different. A woman attended to me. She had the kindest smile I had ever seen. She served me a free cup of coffee and told me I looked tired, he said, almost as the memories returned. Mark remained frozen, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the edge of the table. He knew the woman Vance was talking about. She was the reason for all this. The air in the room became heavy as Vance spoke. Customers who had ruled him out already as another entitled politician now leaned in, eager to hear his story. Vance looked at Mark differently this time. He now realized why Mark may have been doing all this. His eyes softened as he gazed at him. That woman, she's your mother, isn't she? The room gasped collectively, shocked by Vance's statement. Mark's face twisted in rage. He had wondered how long it would take Vance to recognize him and finally remember her. His eyes locked onto Vance, but the recognition in his eyes wasn't just one of shock. It was something much deeper, something personal. Vance continued, his voice softer now with an air of curiosity. He could see it clearly now. This wasn't about the reservation or his presence here. This was something else, but what? I never forgot that night. I barely had money in my wallet, but she didn't care. She made me feel accepted when I needed it the most. There was a deep moment of silence, and although Mark didn't speak, everyone in the room could feel the weight of the words hanging between them, hidden behind wounds neither of them had wanted to unravel. Vance remained quiet for a while, staring at Mark, searching for a reaction, a sigh, a scoff, anything that would confirm if he knew what he was talking about. Now I come back here, Vance's voice wavered. Now I come back here, and I'm told I don't belong. Why? Your mother accepted me gracefully, why can't you? Mark's hands trembled slightly, his voice thick with bitterness, low and dangerous. I knew, he said, his words sharp and measured. I knew who you truly were when you walked in, Mark said. A deep silence engulfed the room, watching the moment unfold between them. Vance furrowed his brows in confusion. Then why? Mark didn't allow him to finish. Because you broke her heart. The space between them was quickly engulfed with silence as soon as those words fell. Vance looked at him, his confusion increasing. "What are you talking about?" he asked. Mark exhaled sharply, his breath hitching as though the words were gnawing at his stomach. He looked at Vance again, and all he felt was years of bottled anger rising. He never thought he would have to express them. He had tried to bury his feelings with her memories. However, he couldn't hold back anymore. "This restaurant," his voice cracked. "It was my mother's dream. She built it from nothing, every inch of it. She poured her heart and everything into this place. And last year," his voice lowered, almost as if reliving an old painful experience, "I almost lost it. The pandemic nearly wiped us out." Mark paused, clenching his fist in anger, his gaze now sharp and resentful. "I begged for a business loan. I applied everywhere. I even reached out to your fund." Vance's eyes widened as he slowly realized what was coming. "You denied me," Mark spat, his voice trembling with rage. "I wrote to your team 3 times and explained everything. My mother, her legacy, and what this place meant to the community. I told them about you." Vance's face went pale, his expression changing into remorse. He didn't know about any of this, but somehow he couldn't help but feel it was his fault. "I denied you?" he asked, his mouth parted in shock. Mark's voice was heavy with emotion. He was no longer concerned with keeping a composed act. Right now, all he wanted was to pour out years of bottled grief and resentment. "They turned me down without a second glance." Vance's stomach twisted. This meant a lot to this man, and he knew he had failed him. No wonder he didn't want him in his restaurant. Still, he felt he needed to clear things up. "I never saw those applications," he said. Not in a way that tried to deny accountability, but in a way that would put things into perspective for Mark. However, Mark's emotions remained the same. He stared at him, eyes burning with something close to pain. "But your name was on the rejection letter," he repeated. "I thought maybe, just maybe, you would remember what she did for you that night," he continued. "But clearly I was wrong. You weren't there. You didn't see her high expectations of you, waiting, believing that you would respond and save this place she loved, but you never did." The words hit Vance like a slap across the face. He froze, a nauseating chill spreading through him. His breath was shallow. He could tell what had happened, but still, somewhere deep down, he wished he wasn't right. At that moment, the world seemed to tilt, and his mind went blank for the first time in years. Even though he kept telling himself he didn't know about it, he couldn't deny the weight of his emotions. He had ignored a plea for help from someone who had once shown him kindness when he needed it most. "What happened to her?" Vance finally summoned the courage to ask. Mark hesitated for a moment and then chuckled softly. It wasn't a mocking laugh, it was more of a painful cry. He reached into his pocket, brought out a small aged envelope and placed it in front of Vance as if it were something fragile. The envelope was worn, its edges curled, and Vance's name was written across the front. Mark looked up at Vance, his eyes filled with grief, pain, and resentment. "She wrote you this right before she passed. She thought maybe you could save the restaurant, but I never sent it." Those words hit Vance like a violent wave. His hands trembled as he picked up the letter. It was delicate, almost fragile, as if it carried the weight of everything he had ignored and failed to see. He glanced at Mark, whose eyes were dark and unreadable. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice filled with empathy. "I never knew." A brief silence stretched between them, and for a moment, no one spoke. There was nothing they could say that wasn't already said. The table was filled with unspoken tension, and Claire lingered around, unsure whether to leave or stay. The room, once filled with an upbeat atmosphere and easy conversations, fell into a deep silence. Even the customers who had pulled out their phones, eager to capture a heated moment, lowered their hands, gripped by the heaviness of what had just unfolded. Mark's revelation left everyone touched and questioning their unspoken words and trauma, which they tried to bury deep down. Mark pulled a chair and sat in front of Vance as if his legs were about to give up. Meanwhile, Vance held the letter in his hands, staring at it as if it might crumble into dust at any moment, but he could not bring himself to open it. What did he owe Mark now? What could he do to undo the damage that had been done? The truth was ugly and uncomfortable, but there was no escaping it. Vance knew he had to face it. The crack between them could never be repaired with money or apologies. It was a debt far greater than anything he could repay. Mark and Vance remained seated in silence. The air between them was thick and heavy with things left unsaid for too long. Mark heaved a deep breath. For years, he had imagined this moment, this confrontation, the way he would feel after he finally got those words off his mind. Now, staring into the face of the man who had walked away from him and his mother, His anger felt different, not gone, but softer. He could see the genuine remorse on Vance's face, and for the first time, the senator wasn't just another politician who failed to hear the people's cries. He was a man just like him, a man who made mistakes. He heaved a deep sigh, his voice low but still laced with pain. "I didn't tell you because I wanted you to feel what she felt," he said. Vance's face sank, but he didn't speak. Mark hesitated for a moment, then looked directly at Vance, his eyes unreadable. "I wanted you to know what it's like to be ignored by someone you trusted." The space between them filled with silence again. For years, Mark had believed that his resentment kept him in control, but sitting here, looking at Vance's hollow expression, he wondered if he had been wrong all along. Vance didn't look like he wanted to argue. He looked shattered. A moment went by and Vance still didn't do anything. Finally, he picked up the letter and stared directly at Mark. "If I could go back, I would," he said, his voice low and almost broken. Mark let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "But you can't." There was a long pause after his response. He expected Vance to argue, deflect, or try to shift the blame, but he didn't. Instead, he nodded slowly, staring at the letter with a deeply reflective look. "Neither can you." Mark's breath hitched. The words settled deep in his chest. Vance exhaled and met Mark's gaze. "So how about instead of focusing on the past, we try to move on together? Your mother showed me kindness once, when I didn't think the world owed me any. I know it may be asking too much, but I would like it if you give me the same chance she did," Vance said, his voice edged with something that sounded almost like hope, and then it softened. "It's what your mother would have wanted." Mark remained frozen, processing his words. His heart raced, and so did the anger he felt before returning. But it wasn't just that. There was something else there. He never thought he could forgive Vance for what he did. He thought forgiveness meant excusing what he had done. Now he felt something different. Forgiving Vance didn't mean he was weak or discarded what he did. It meant that he was ready to move on and heal from his past wounds. It was about freeing himself. He swallowed hard, staring directly at Vance until something shifted. He didn't know if he could forgive him entirely, not yet, but maybe he could stop letting the past define him. His fingers twitched on the table and then he nodded. Neither of them spoke. The restaurant remained frozen, eager to see their resolve. Vance's fingers tightened on the letter. He still hadn't opened it, but somehow, he felt he knew what was already written. Finally, Mark cleared his throat. "I don't know if I can just let it go." Vance nodded, as if he expected his response. "I understand that. Forgiveness isn't forgetting, but you can decide not to let the past hold you back from being free." He set down the letter between them, then raised his hand, signaling, "Claire, get us 2 coffees." Mark let out a slow breath. He wanted to believe that he could move on from this eventually. Maybe the first step was sharing a drink with Vance. The tension between them eased up. Although lighter, he could still feel it there. But this time, he wasn't going to let it decide his actions. As Claire walked away to get their coffee, none of them spoke. They didn't have to. And for the first time in years, Mark's unresolved feelings didn't feel like a rope tying him down anymore. It felt like a possibility. JD Vance's encounter with Mark may have started confrontationally. However, their interaction changed the outcome and became a moment that left many reflecting on the core power of forgiveness and human discourse. Their encounter showed that forgiveness is never easy and may often feel impossible. It isn't about erasing the past, but taking away its power over you. What do you think? Can forgiveness and accountability truly exist? Would public reactions be the same if the political roles were reversed? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe to this channel. Before you go, watch the next video on your screen.